So morning to those online as well as in the room. I've been preparing for this talk for a few weeks, and in the shower the phrase occurred to me, Buddhism is not a life hack. And maybe that indicates that I look at social media a little bit too much. I've deleted off all of the apps off my phone, but family is on Facebook, so it's inevitable. And the misunderstandings of Buddhism are quite stunning. You see much more misunderstanding than you do of insight. Not to say that the advice that ends up being called a life hack isn't sometimes useful. Sometimes there's a lot of wisdom to advice, but a lot of the quotes attributed to the Buddha or to the Dalai Lama, oh, come on. It's the most, I think you would agree that the most misunderstood aspect about Buddhism is not acknowledging that it's about realizing that the self does not exist, that ego is an illusion. So the idea of a life hack, which seems very self-oriented, self-protecting, is exactly something that we want to undo, right? You know, the old traditional metaphor of the rope is not a snake. Do you know that story? I think that the original apocryphal story probably was of a monk in his room, and it's dark, and maybe he thinks something moves or there's a shadow, and he becomes convinced that there is a snake in the corner of his room, and he cannot sleep all night long. He's just frozen in fear. And the next morning, when there is light, he sees that all along it was a coil of rope. So the handy metaphor is, it's not that we are killing ego, dismantling something that exists. It's more realizing that it never existed in the first place. The rope was never a snake. That's not really my main theme today, but that's what I woke up with this morning. And because my talk, which is called Becoming a Dharmic Person, is so literally based on a teaching by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, or something that he conveyed, he didn't make it up himself. And I was studying one of the Vajrayana seminary transcripts, Vajradhatu seminary transcripts, the one from 1979, looks like that. It looked like this back in the 90s when I was studying them. Now they're in nicely bound volumes and you can buy them on Amazon. But it's one of those things I will never get rid of. You know, I have my whole set of seminary transcripts, and they're very precious to me. But because I'm so directly speaking from a talk that Trungpa Rinpoche gave to his seminary students in 1979, I feel like it's incumbent on me to tell you a little bit about Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche's approach to teaching, the system that he set up in the West for teaching Western students. And it's a tradition that I stepped into. I had been studying Trungpa Rinpoche's books, starting with Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, which every Buddhist should read. In the 80s, I had a friend who introduced me to his teachings, his, at the time, cassette tapes of talks. And I was living in Austin, and there was an Austin Dharmadhatu, now called Austin Shambhala Center. And it seemed like such a big leap to go from reading books and feeling a personal connection, but very kind of private and isolated connection to these ideas, to actually stepping into a Dharma center. It seemed like a huge leap. And I think it is a huge leap in our culture to do that. So I remember vividly, I was in an office in where I was working at the time in April of 1987, and I decided I would make the phone call the Austin Dharmadhatu, find out when I could connect, what it looks like to step in for the first time. Can I receive meditation instruction from a person? What does that look like? And the person I talked to said, "Oh, yes, that is something that we usually do, of course, and we're so glad you called and are interested, but Trungpa Rinpoche has just died. It was just a couple of days before." And that was my first connection. So it felt from the very beginning that I was connected somehow to Trungpa Rinpoche himself. And I don't know how mystical or how much I'm making that up, but it's always felt that way. So I attended seminary in 1990. Well, there was a sort of a mini seminary in 97, and then a full 3-month seminary in 1999. But for seminary students, one of the primary preparations for us was to read the seminary transcripts. All of the transcripts from 1973 to 1986. And they were all, in these kind of volumes, and rich and full of teachings to ponder and ask questions about, and it was challenging in the best way. Another preparation for seminary was a month-long meditation retreat called the Da Tun. Da means moon, and Tun means, meditation or retreat or something. So a month of practice, which was 9 hours a day, oryoki meals, functional talking, so silence for periods of time, and then you were allowed to functionally talk, which was things like, could you pass the salt? It was not, boy, my legs are killing me. That was not considered the functional part of speech. It's practicing mindful speech in that way. So that's just all to say that the seminary students were prepared somewhat. They had gone through some preparation to show up. And yet, at the very beginning of every year of the seminary transcripts, Trungpa Rinpoche starts from the very beginning. So by 1979, students had studied the transcripts from 73 to 78. They were familiar with his approach to teaching the Dharma. And yet, in this talk in 1979, he tells his students, nothing, I'm not trying to insult you or anything, but perhaps we all need a little bit more toilet training. We need to remember what it looks like to be a Dharmic person, and for the Dharma not to become an ornament of ego. One of the early traps of a meditation student is taking themselves too seriously. I have found everything that I need. And thank goodness for the Sangha to give an elbow in the ribs every once in a while and say, don't take yourself too seriously, we're all in this. But the bigger danger is the phrase cutting through spiritual materialism, referring to using the teachings to feel more like oneself, I am getting better. I am apart from humanity. I am really hot stuff. There are so many kind of smarmy ways that we can use the Dharma. And sometimes the social media version gets a bit smarmy. So this talk is called Becoming a Dharmic Person. And it's a list of characteristics. It's a list of 7 characteristics. So I'm going to go through them one at a time. They're a set of loose categories, so they all kind of blend into each other, have to do with each other. And each one of them is rich, and you could spend some time with each one at a time. And Trungpa Rinpoche stated that this was like many lists in Buddhism, this is a traditional list of characteristics that he was taught as a Kaji student in Tibet. So he very much was keen to teach his students in the rigorous way that he was taught as a young monk in Tibet. And at the same time, he had a tremendous curiosity and passion for cutting through the Western mind, speaking to the heart of an American student. So sometimes his language is quite colorful. So he comes up with something like toilet training, which is really completely meant to kind of poke a little hole in ego. So the first category is called passionlessness. Makes sense in Buddhism, right? Passion, aggression, ignorance, the 3 biggies that we look at. This is how ego builds up itself and how it protects itself is with these poisons. How ego is recreated continually. Passionlessness, in this case, is a way to point out the little subtle ways that we want things to be different than they are. I'm bored. I reach for my phone. Or I need some gum, or maybe I'll listen to a podcast, but the instinct is to cover up that moment of a gap. I'm bored, I'm antsy, I'm irritated, somehow uncomfortable. And to notice how we really want to change that moment. So, it might be something that we completely justify in our culture, getting irritated with the driver who cuts us off or who is just rude even to someone else. It's not even affecting us. Driving here, I'm being tailgated and I'm watching cars in front of me tailgate other drivers. And you notice that feeling of judgment, of irritation, of perhaps even feeling unsafe for a moment, but those little flashes of feeling, they can turn into a storyline. They can turn into feeling the agitation and justifying the agitation. Do you know what I mean? It's like, I am right and they are wrong is really the basis of that feeling. So passionlessness has to do with that as well, of noticing our irritation and just letting it be a little moment of irritation, not doing anything about it. He also gives a couple of examples that hit home for me. He says, you can't even stand a few seconds of chill. You immediately put a sweater on. It's too hot, it's too cold. Adjust the thermostat. If your tea is not all that good, if it's slightly bitter, you automatically reach for the sugar pot and put several spoonfuls of sugar in your tea. So what's the alternative? You taste that tea, that's not quite right, and for a moment, you really feel that not rightness. You might still end up putting sugar in your tea, or milk, or starting fresh with a new cup. But with some kind of, there's a sense of humor in all of this. It's like, oh, yeah, this is what I'm getting upset about right now. My tea is not perfect. In Western society, when any little irritation comes up, there's always something to cure it. They even sell little pads to stick on your spectacles to keep them from sliding down. From little things like pads for your spectacles to the biggest of the biggest. As long as anybody can afford it, the Western approach is to cure any kind of boredom, any kind of irritation at all. So passion is connected with being unable to relate with boredom, needing some kind of sustaining power. And a practitioner is someone who can maintain himself, who can relate with boredom. Does that make sense? I spent a lot of time thinking about this category. And I must say, too, in this tradition that I come from, we talk a lot about meditation and post-meditation. Is that a concept that people talk about here? Meditation is the actual practice on the cushion. Post-meditation is everything else. And the notion is that post-meditation is practice. So we are working toward 24-hour practice. And if you did not approach that with a little bit of a light touch, you'd go insane. We have to have a light touch, not taking it too seriously, but at the same time bringing some awareness to that, remembering our practice. The students of Trungpa Rinpoche at this point have already studied the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path and the skandhas and the samskaras, and really steeped themselves in fundamental teachings. And then he's talking about passionlessness, just simply noticing suffering in the moment, just noticing. We are so spoiled and so privileged that sometimes our suffering is fairly subtle, but it's easy to gloss over, right? It's easy to smooth over. A feeling of, I used to contemplate this when I would have to go and say something to my boss in the office. And I would stand at his doorway, maybe it was just going to be a 2-sentence conversation, so I didn't have to come in and sit down. But I'm standing there and I'm suddenly realizing I don't know what to do with my hands. Should I lean casually on the doorway? Should I stay up? Those are the little moments we're talking about, those little moments of self-consciousness, of awkwardness. It's easy. It's so easy to just put a little gloss on it to appear that you're okay. But being caught in appearing that one is okay is such a trap, because this path is making us genuine. If I feel awkward, it's not going to last forever. I'll feel awkward and the feeling will pass. So why not just feel awkward? With no labeling, no story, trusting that the truth of impermanence means that this is going to shift and change. So passionlessness, I think, takes us very far. The second category he talked about is, he called contentment. No surprise. Which also is, maybe it's a nice relief coming after all this talk about irritation and awkwardness. True contentment, genuine contentment, unconditional contentment. You know, it's very much about appreciating what we have. It's not idiot contentment. Trungpa Rinpoche, in his vivid use of the English language, would sometimes, if he was talking about compassion, he would warn his students about idiot compassion. About compassion that didn't have discernment and intelligence behind it. So here there's a possibility of idiot contentment. So what does genuine contentment mean? You know, I have a cancer history. I actually had a recurrence last year. So it's a thing in my mind, more so in my mind than actually in my physical experience, honestly. I'm not going to say exactly that I'm glad I have cancer, but I can certainly appreciate my life and the particular things that the contribution of cancer in my life has brought to my life. If I'm in the hospital, I can appreciate the technicians and the nurses and the doctors and have a genuine conversation. And that snap of, I didn't realize how comfortable I was until I have to spend a couple of days in the hospital, remembering to be grateful for the life that I usually take for granted. The fact that I can wake up at home and take care of my cats and have breakfast with my husband and all of those little things that we so take for granted. There's even, he uses the word celebration in this section of his talk, that we can celebrate, have a sense of real celebration. And be grateful for those things in our life that wake us up and help us to realize that life is precious. If I talk too much about that, I'm going to cry, so I'm not going to. The last thing he says about contentment, which spoke to me a lot, he said, you can have some appreciation even of obstacles becoming simplicity. Your car breaks down, you go out to your car, you're about to go and do something, and your car is not agreeing with your plan, and suddenly you can't go forward with that plan. We could just appreciate that we suddenly have a simpler hour. We're not going to be in traffic. You know, yes, things are disappointing, and yes, my current life is okay. The next category is a delightful one. He calls it preventing too many activities or reducing activities. This speaks to me because between you and me and the walls, I have ADHD. I was diagnosed I was diagnosed at the age of 39. I'm 62 and I'm still appreciating and understanding the impact that it has on my life. And one very obvious one is that I have way too many interests. My bookcases are one example of that. And it's been a very conscious effort to kind of step back and look at the major categories of interests that I have in my life. Not all of the different organizations I'd like to support and all of the different, but when I think about it, it all breaks down into 2 or 3 categories. And I can mindfully choose to devote my effort, my time in a particular direction and take one at a time. I know someone who told me once that she doesn't have time to meditate because there's so much going on in Houston. There are 6 events happening in Midtown this weekend. Maybe I'll be able to go to all 6. That's what he's pointing to, is preventing too many activities, preventing too much entertainment. I'm going to read again a little bit of his language because it's so colorful. You can become chummy with the world so you don't have to hold your discipline or your mindfulness properly. If you don't like tea, you can have coffee. If you don't like coffee, you could switch to Coca-Cola. If you don't like Coca-Cola, you can drink scotch or tequila. You involve yourself in constant activity. You are making decisions all the time. The possibilities are endless. In this principle, you have to cut that down. When you become too chummy with your world, too familiar with your world, it becomes endless. You can't possibly do it all, and you begin to feel that you are not capable of doing even one thing properly. And I think it's speaking of life hacks, I think it's wonderful that he's actually using this language to point out something in a very traditional Buddhist list of the benefit to our practice and to our life of simplifying. If a relationship is on your list, it had better be close to the top of your list. It had better be one of the few main things that you work on. The next category, number 4, is good conduct, which is quite straightforward. It's a sense of mindfulness and awareness in our everyday life. Awareness in post-meditation sometimes can sound like it's our chore, it's our job, I must stay aware. But it's actually quite simple. It's actually about being awake, being wakeful. We can fall asleep in habits. If you have ever driven to work and not remembered quite how you got there, we were not very awake, which is scary. We should be wakeful driving, among other things. But as simple as the walk from the seat in your car to here, were you aware? By the way, I noticed a cat under one of the cars. Can I just switch gears, as I like to do, for a moment and say that 2 weeks ago we had a kitten trapped under our car, and I discovered it by starting my car. And she's fine. She was in the right place. This little kitty has good karma. And we had an 8-week-old kitty in our house for 2 weeks. Phew. And my niece and her family have adopted her. They've named her Toulouse Eclair. Very French. And she is in a very happy home. I've since learned that one bit of advice, especially when the weather is cool, then it wasn't even cool, it was warm and humid. Today it's cool. Just as a matter of habit, before you get in your car, bang 3 times on the hood of your car. Now this cat was in the undercarriage. She was only this far from the ground, but she was too terrified to jump down. She had space to jump down and escape. And because of that, I got my stepdaughter to help me. The 2 of us had to, one from the hood and one from underneath. We finally got her. And from that point, she was no longer a stray. So she was really one lucky kitty. So be aware of the small sentient beings around us. The notion of awareness. He says, by the way, the opposite of waking up is falling asleep. That kind of sleep is not usually very pleasant. It's very sweaty and energy consuming. It downgrades you. It's like putting your head in the sand and trying to hide, ostrich style. This kind of sleep is avoiding the possibility of any realization. You just feel bad about yourself and about the consequences of your existence, which is not as glamorous as you would like it to be. I used to have that kind of lazy sleep experience when I was a college student. So that going back to bed was a really awful kind of sleep, non-sleep sleep. I don't want to be up, but I'm miserable in bed kind of sleep. So the notion here of good conduct is appreciating being wakeful and present for every moment. It has to do with also noticing the gaps that are talked about in passionlessness. So feeling a gap that we interpret as a moment of boredom, that gap can also be wakeful. That gap can actually be a reminder to wake up. So we're shifting gears, we make dinner, we're busy, we have dinner, and then there's the dishes, but there are little gaps in all of that. You know, there are gaps between one dish and the next. There are always moments that can remind us to wake up. Number 5 is awareness of the teacher. And in my mind, this really points to thinking about the lineage of teachers. From teacher to student, on and on through time, such that we can study the Dharma. And I think it really cuts through any sense of, I've studied Buddhism and isn't it cool? Think of how much and how many lives were committed to the Dharma over generations and generations so that we could wake up to our life. So appreciating especially the lineage teachers who devoted their lives to propagating these teachings and studying them and practicing them. Number 6, he calls propagating prajna. One translation of prajna is transcendent knowledge. In this sense, he's talking about propagating your own intellect, your own understanding of the Dharma. So we study the constituents of ego, right? We study the nature of suffering. We study the samskaras, all of these different temporary mental states that one can experience. And he says, you should find out and understand who you are and what you are made of. You should find out what your mind is made out of, what your mind's projections are made out of, and what your relationship with your world is made out of. And he's talking here about studying the Abhidharma and studying teachings that help us to understand what mind actually is. And that this is part of becoming a Dharmic person, is really having that clear insight about our states of mind, about how the mind is constantly projecting, about the possibility that meditation, shamatha and vipassana, mindfulness and awareness can shake up our attachment to ego. And number 7 is an attitude of goodness. And this comes from our own meditation practice, comes from our discipline. It comes from our genuine human experience of bringing these teachings into our life. He says, there's nothing to say about it particularly, except keep on sitting, and you will find out that both sanity and insanity exist in you. Insanity is not particularly regarded as an obstacle. It is simply regarded as kindling wood. Because of your insanity, you are here. But you don't stop there. You go beyond, and you brighten up greater sanity by sitting and perfectly watching your activities. So I would like to stop there. Those are the 7. And see if you have any thoughts, or we could have a discussion.
Celeste, I have a question. Thank you for sharing personal stories as well as the Dharma, which your personal story is the Dharma as well. Question about category 2. Everything that contentment, everything that you explained.
Contentment.
I thought my keyword was gratitude or gratefulness. Some of the examples that you used were gratefulness or gratitude towards things that did not happen to us. Sometimes we are thankful for many things that happen, but forget actually about to be grateful that I made it safely to, the English Dharma group this morning and did not have an accident, or my car did not break down. So, did I understand this correctly, that they are connected when he describes contentment?
So if I can summarize your question for those online, is relating contentment with appreciating what we have, and also being grateful that we don't have certain difficulties, and really seems to be related, right? So
I would have. My keyword was gratitude.
Gratitude.
So I was curious, the contentment part and gratitude, how they work together. I find so much gratitude in the category that he is offering.
Yeah, gratitude and contentment, yes. The word he uses mostly is appreciation.
Okay.
And gratitude is interesting because I can be very literal-minded sometimes, and for myself, my question is, who am I grateful to? And in a non-theistic tradition, there isn't someone I'm grateful to, although I do feel tremendously grateful. I think they are related. Basically, we're talking about, first of all, the awareness that we always have complaints and problems and such, but it could be much worse. And actually what we have in the moment is so rich, and just full of opportunity. I'm going to reread a little bit of what he said about that. Contentment is also connected with appreciating what you have, with some sense of rejoicing, which is often very hard. You are constantly involved with possibilities of change, all the time changing from one thing to another. You cannot celebrate your own life as what you have, what you are. You are unable to celebrate the simplicity of the practice itself and the simplicity of life. But being contented with what you have is a celebration. So I think largely we're saying the same things. Ordinarily, people talk in terms of obstacles. I had a bad time. I didn't have any chewing gum in my pocket. I had a bad day. But you could switch gears altogether. It was such a relief to find I didn't have any chewing gum in my pocket. I feel fine. I just let it go. So obviously a lot of a sense of humor in that. Is there more of a question about that?
No, I think it's
Yeah.
it's not really, when I say important, and maybe not the right word. It just, I noticed that a lot of the things that you were speaking about, that you spoke about, reminded me of gratitude. And there's no need to say it is this or that. It is together. And on a personal note, I left my cell phone at work one day, and as I was home, I noticed, as I was already driving, I thought, oh shoot, I left my phone at work. Now I don't have a phone all afternoon, evening, night. Oh gosh, how can I survive this? It was interesting what happened there, that I almost panicked and kind of used whatever, Facebook, Instagram, Messenger to let my children know that I'm okay. And it was interesting to see how quiet that evening was. And,
Yes, without our phone.
You don't have to look at it. There's no, the work goes on. So, great reminder. Thank you.
Yeah, I think contentment is a really strong word. To feel contented that you left your phone at work, and that therefore you have a quiet evening. Even though you reach out to your family to make sure, you're still alive, realize that our contentment was not based on our phone. We tend to think it's just so important. I mean, I can't stand to miss a phone call, which means I end up in my own house. I'm taking my phone from room to room. That's insane. So I want to pause for a second. Let me check online and see if there are any questions, and then we'll go to the room. Any comments from online? Yes, please.
I like the word he used, idiot contentment. I think, it's just like we don't need more. We cannot always, it could have been better. We don't have to ask that question. So this is a new term for me to contemplate on. Thank you.
Yeah, I think thank you for saying that. I think it's really helpful myself. It's a real reminder of where we can kind of go astray in our thinking about these things. Yeah, thank you.
It's just as good as it is good as is, doesn't need any more.
Yes, very well said. Gosh, I can't remember the name of the author. Does anyone know the book Loving What Is? Or Love What Is? I'll remember the author. But it looks exactly at that, regardless of the circumstance. Love what is. Just very, very simple and straightforward.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Harry, you had your hand up?
Well, this is kind of remarkable because I think I had a very similar question as Charlene about idiot
Eva.
contentment, and this also overlaps a lot, I think, of what Barbara was wondering about. So going back to your second category, and there's this apparent contrast between, it's called idiot contentment, and I guess genuine or wise contentment. So, and a lot of what you said in those 7 points made me think of awareness. And I'll bring all this together, I hope, in a clear question. But for much of my life, I've been a master of avoidance.
Master
and,
of
things
avoidance.
that really irritate me or are pains in whatever way, I commonly, all my life, I've just avoided them. And even your little story about the cat under the car, you know, I mean, a central kind of teaching is we should be more aware. So I guess getting closer to my question, there are a lot of things in my life that are irritating to me and some sources of pain. And I guess I've learned on the one hand that I should not avoid them. I should, like what does Pema Chodron say, kind of lean into things that might be irritating or negative, you know, not to avoid them. So I guess my real question goes back to if you could say a little bit more about the contrast between idiot contentment and just like, oh, you know, cancer, or these serious pains like, oh, you know, oh, I accept them or no problem. If you can say a little bit more about idiot contentment versus the good contentment, and perhaps a little bit more specifically, what would kind of a healthy awareness, a healthy allowance, and a healthy acknowledgement of our pains and irritation look like as it kind of perhaps gets closer to any kind of real genuine contentment? Does that question make sense? Probably.
The last part of what you said, can you repeat that? What would
Yes,
it look like?
What could you say, I guess the question is, could you say a little bit more about both what genuine contentment is itself, and especially in relation to pains and things that irritate us? And,
What is genuine contentment, especially in relation to what irritates us, what is painful, what our suffering? Well, one thing that occurs to me related to all of this is the approach of letting the thoughts and the storyline go and just feeling the irritation or the pain, the disappointment. And the remarkable thing really is that there's something I just read this morning. It was an article published a few years ago by an author I will tell you about in a minute, but he gave the example of watching a sunset. And you have all sorts of thoughts about the sunset and opinions about this beautiful sunset. But you could drop all of the thoughts and just for a moment lean into the feeling that that sunset has provoked. Just simply feeling it without even trying to put a label, finding words for it. Just let yourself feel it. And the particular point in this article was that it's amazing that when we do this for negative experiences, stop the thought and just feel that awkwardness or pain or whatever it is, it has a way of shifting and drifting, changing. And if we do this with something very positive, a moment of joy, it actually helps that moment linger. So that's the opposite of clinging to positive ideas and trying to push away negative ideas, but it's leaning to whatever, really tasting the flavor of that moment in its fullness. We are wired with language, and we so want to put words to things. We do that. That's just how we're wired. So the practice is that we don't cling to those words. We don't cling to the concept and the idea. The words will arise, but let the word dissipate and notice the feeling. Does that help?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
This kind of maybe expand on what you were talking about a little bit, but I found the use of the word passionate in the first Or it's kind of one of those uses of language is like a inflammatory idea, because it was definitely triggering, because when you think of passionlessness, like passion as a negative thing, right? It kind of reframes it. But I thought of more of the description of what passionlessness was a reaction to emotion. And it kind of just got me thinking about what, the teacher may think of just passion in itself as a positive thing, because I feel as though you might be able to, instead of rejecting, your immediate passionate reaction to something, seeing it as a beautiful experience of emotion, just being in the moment, the present moment. I feel like that dichotomy, like that relationship between the two is kind of interesting. Do we control and, level and stoic sort of way, or do we just be in the moment and present in the reaction?
Right. Yeah, the passionlessness, as if passion is a problem, versus the joyful passion of just being alive in the moment. That rich. It's a very good observation. That's actually what this path, in my understanding, is actually all about. Is really being willing to experience the fullness of each moment. That there's a rich sense of being alive. And these moments are fleeting and can't be grasped, and yet when we really wake up to a rich moment, it's there's a lot of joy there. And that celebration is natural. That's not something we have to drum up. It's a natural outgrowth of our awareness. Yes, that's something to observe in your life and contemplate and appreciate, for sure. One final thought, anyone? Yes?
I was thinking of how you kept bringing up gaps in time. And I'm listening to The Power of Now right now, and he talks about to listen to your thoughts, observe them, and I notice when I do, I'm so ensconced in my thoughts. I can immediately switch gears and then notice them, but it's hard for me to always stay observing my thoughts. So that to me, that's how I related to that. That feels like a gap in time. I can switch to the ultimate observer, but it's hard for me to integrate the two. I didn't know if that's kind of
right. So observing thoughts in experience, it can actually feel kind of like you're always looking at the past, you're looking at the moment that just happened, right? Which is probably accurate, actually. You have a thought, and a moment later, that thought has been fully formed, and you're now aware of what that thought is. I think my understanding is there's an observer of an observer, and it becomes like a hall of mirrors until you learn to drop observation altogether. It is possible that the observer actually does not exist, but it's a stepping stone to relaxed awareness and openness. So the notion of paying attention to thoughts is bringing tremendous honesty and genuineness to the moment, right? We are in the moment, we are noticing this thought, we are letting it go. And at some point, as our meditation practice develops, those thoughts settle. It's like settling to the bottom, like dirt settling to the bottom of the jar. Just we're relaxed so that there's more space, but there's more clarity. You can see further. And you can see those thoughts and not necessarily have an opinion about them. They're just mental activity, just neurons firing. Is that helpful? Yeah. Any other final thoughts online? Any other contributions? Yes.
Thank you for is it possible to share the full write-up of the test?
Please.
I believe so, especially since it's been released in published form. So what I can do is share with you folks the reference, and I'll also make a copy of the pages and send it.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, good question. Any final burning questions or thoughts? Any insights to share? Thank you all. Thanks for the invitation, and it was lovely to see you all.